Only real grandchildren get a piece of the pie. My dad sneered. My daughter pushed her plate away. My husband glanced at my parents, then at our little girl, and without a hint of warning, tapped his wine glass, stood up, and said something that made everyone freeze. I'll never forget that dinner. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering, one of those Sunday evenings where everyone brings a dish and pretends nothing is wrong. But as soon as we sat down, I could feel something in the air, something heavier than the smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread. My dad, as always, had that smirk on his face. It wasn't just a smirk, it was a weapon. He leaned back in his chair and, with perfect timing, delivered the line that would shatter the evening. Only real grandchildren get a piece of the pie. He sneered, like a king pronouncing judgment. I froze. My daughter, who had been happily nibbling on her bread, slowly pushed her plate away. Her little eyes, wide and innocent, darted between my parents and me. I could see the confusion, the hurt, the sudden awareness that she wasn't welcome in some invisible, cruel family hierarchy. The room went silent. Even the clinking of forks against plates seemed to vanish. My husband, who had been quietly sipping his wine, turned to look at my parents. And then he looked at our little girl. That moment, his gaze, was like something electric. Time slowed, and I felt it. Everyone in the room sensed something was about to happen, though no one could guess what. Then, without a hint of warning, he lifted his hand and tapped his glass. Just one sharp tap, but it sounded like a gunshot in the tension-filled silence. Everyone's eyes turned toward him. My parents stiffened. My daughter tilted her head, curious. He stood up. Tall, calm, unshakable. The room held its breath. And then he spoke. Then you're not the ones getting any tonight. The words were simple, but the effect was catastrophic. My father's smirk froze into something unfamiliar, shock, maybe fear. My mother's hand trembled on the table, her napkin crumpling between her fingers. My daughter's eyes sparkled, a mix of awe and relief. She finally understood that someone in this room had her back. Then my husband did something no one expected. He reached over, gently took my daughter's plate, and lifted it in front of everyone. This belongs to her, he said. His voice was calm, almost soft, but every syllable carried authority. All of it. Every bite. My dad opened his mouth, probably to protest, but the words didn't come. My mother looked like she was calculating the quickest escape. And our daughter? She smiled, that full, radiant smile that made everything feel right in the world. She took her first bite, and suddenly the tension melted, replaced with the sound of laughter, tentative at first, then genuine, unstoppable. I looked at my husband and felt something shift inside me. That moment, that simple gesture of standing up for our child, revealed a side of him I had always admired but never fully appreciated. He was fearless, protective, and unwaveringly fair. And in that room, where tradition and pride had tried to dictate who was worthy, he rewrote the rules. Dinner continued, but nothing was ever the same. My parents avoided his gaze for the rest of the evening, and every so often, I would catch my daughter glancing at him with a mixture of pride and love. That night, she learned something important, that real family isn't always the one who claims bloodlines or authority. Sometimes, real family is the one who stands up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's terrifying, and says, "This is yours, no one can take it." Even now, years later, whenever I think back to that night, I remember the clink of the glass, the pause in the air, the shift in power that was so subtle and yet so monumental. I remember how my daughter learned to stand tall, how my husband became a hero without raising his voice, and how my parents were forced to confront a truth they hadn't been ready to face. Love and protection cannot be dictated, they are chosen. And I realized something else, something almost frightening in its clarity. Moments like these don't just change the course of a single evening. They change the course of generations. They teach children what courage looks like, what integrity feels like, and what it means to be truly, undeniably valued. That dinner was supposed to be ordinary. But it became unforgettable. It became a story that, to this day, we tell over and over, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with tears, because it reminds us all of one undeniable truth: real power doesn't come from fear or tradition. It comes from standing up for the ones you love, even when the whole world expects you to sit down. And my daughter? She still remembers that night. She still talks about it, wide-eyed and passionate, because in her little heart, she learned something invaluable: that sometimes, being small doesn't matter, because the people who love you will make sure you always get your piece of the pie. After that night, our house never felt the same. My daughter couldn't sleep for hours. She sat on her bed, clutching her stuffed bear, whispering the words my husband had said over and over. "This is yours. No one can take it." I quietly sat beside her, and she leaned against me, as if seeking reassurance that it was true. I thought about my parents. Their faces haunted me, my father's smirk replaced by shock, my mother's hands trembling as if she'd just seen a ghost. It wasn't just that they were embarrassed, it was the realization that control and tradition weren't absolute. My husband had broken an unspoken law, and the room had been forced to acknowledge it. The next morning was eerily quiet. Breakfast was a tense affair, with everyone avoiding eye contact. My parents barely spoke, as if the words themselves might remind them of their humiliation. My husband, on the other hand, simply smiled at our daughter as she sat down, and she smiled back with a newfound confidence that made my heart ache with pride. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The moment my husband stood up, tapped his glass, and spoke, it wasn't just a defense of our child. It was a declaration. It was saying, "I will not let anyone diminish the people I love. Not you. Not anyone." That simple act had shifted the entire balance of our family, and I realized how rarely such courage is truly witnessed. Days turned into weeks, and subtle changes began to ripple through our family. My daughter, once timid around her grandparents, started speaking up. Her laughter became louder, her steps bolder. My parents, though still polite, treated her differently, less like a guest to be judged, more like a presence that demanded recognition. I also began to notice something in myself. That night had opened my eyes to patterns I had ignored for years. I had often let my parents' subtle criticisms shape my decisions, my self-confidence, my own sense of worth. Watching my husband stand up so calmly, yet so firmly, I felt a mix of relief, admiration, and awakening. If he could do it, maybe I could too. And then came the moment I hadn't expected, my daughter repeating my husband's words to others, insisting on fairness in her own small ways, correcting tiny injustices in playgrounds, at school, even at family gatherings. I watched her grow, and I realized that night wasn't just a victory for her, it was a turning point for all of us. It taught us what courage looks like, what love looks like, and that sometimes, the smallest act, tapping a glass, speaking firmly, can echo for years. Months later, my parents invited us for another dinner. The tension was still there, faint but noticeable. But my daughter, sitting tall at the table, smiled confidently. And when my father looked at her, I saw a flicker of respect, hesitant maybe, but real. She had won, not through confrontation, but by being supported, by being seen, by having someone stand firmly beside her when the world tried to say she didn't belong. And that is what I remember most about that night, not the fear, not the tension, but the quiet, undeniable truth that courage can change everything. That even in the smallest, most ordinary moments, someone's actions can rewrite the rules for generations. My daughter will never forget it. I'll never forget it. And honestly, sometimes I catch myself thinking, if one simple dinner can change so much, what other walls could we break down if we dared to stand up, to speak, to defend the ones we love? Because at the end of the day, the real lesson is simple: blood alone does not define family. Love, courage, and unwavering protection do. And once you understand that, nothing, and no one, can take it away. Weeks passed, but the tension from that night lingered like an uninvited shadow. My parents avoided the topic entirely, though every glance and half-smile betrayed their unease. My father no longer spoke in his usual condescending tone, and my mother's subtle critiques had softened, replaced by a careful politeness that was almost surreal. Yet there was still a quiet storm beneath the surface, a storm that reminded us all that some wounds don't heal overnight. My husband, as calm and composed as ever, never flaunted his small victory. He simply continued to treat our daughter as she deserved, with respect, encouragement, and unwavering belief in her worth. Watching him, I realized the gravity of what had happened. That one act, tapping the glass, standing up, speaking with certainty, wasn't just the defense of our child. It was a revelation. Courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it's quiet, precise, and undeniable. Our daughter, sensing the shift in the household, began to change as well. She held her head a little higher, spoke a little louder, and smiled a little wider. I watched her at school, at the park, at family gatherings, and it was as if the world had finally granted her permission to exist fully, unapologetically. The night of the pie had become a lesson she carried everywhere, a talisman of validation and protection. One afternoon, my father called me unexpectedly. His voice was softer than I had ever heard. "I wanted to apologize," he said, hesitant, almost fragile, "for what I said that night. You're right. We were wrong." I paused, the words heavy in my chest. I had imagined countless versions of this conversation, but hearing it now, I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering anger. I replied carefully, "It's not just about apologies. It's about understanding and change. That night, it wasn't just for me. It was for her." After that call, our family dynamics slowly shifted again. The power balance, once rigid and dictated by tradition, began to tilt subtly. My daughter became a symbol of change, her presence a gentle but firm reminder that love and courage matter more than hierarchy or bloodlines. And yet, the memory of that night never left us. Every holiday, every gathering, every shared meal carried an echo of it. The clink of glasses, the pause before he spoke, the quiet defiance, it replayed in our minds, a story we could never forget. My daughter would recount it with pride, my husband would tell it with understated humility, and I would remember it as the night I truly understood the power of standing up, the weight of a single moment, and the legacy it can create. Because that night taught us something profound. Real family is not defined by tradition, or expectation, or even by blood. It is defined by those who protect, who defend, who believe in you when the world doubts. And once you witness that, once you feel it, you realize that courage, true courage, can change everything, one quiet, decisive act at a time. From that moment on, every dinner we shared, every laugh, every tear, every mundane conversation, carried the weight of that night. And in our hearts, we knew one thing for certain: no one would ever take our slice of the pie again. Months turned into a year, but that single night never left our minds. Every time we sat down together as a family, I could feel the invisible threads of that evening, threads of tension, fear, courage, and love, stretching across the table. My daughter had grown bolder. She no longer flinched at sharp words or disapproving looks. Instead, she met them with quiet confidence, the lessons of that night embedded deep in her heart. Then came another dinner, one that would surpass the first in tension. My parents had invited us again, and the room smelled of roasted chicken and tension, thick enough to touch. My father, ever proud, tried to reclaim his usual dominance, dropping small, passive-aggressive comments. My mother, more cautious now, subtly tested my husband's patience. I could see it all, the power struggle, the old dynamics, but this time, something was different. My daughter sat in her chair, poised and calm. When my father made a cutting remark about her abilities, she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him straight in the eyes and repeated, almost word for word, what my husband had said a year ago. "This is mine. No one can take it away." The room froze. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hands gripped the table. And then my husband, without a word, tapped his glass. One sharp, confident tap. Silence fell. Every eye in the room was on him. He stood slowly, deliberately, and said in that calm voice that carried a storm beneath it, "Not now, not ever. She deserves her place, her voice, her respect. And if that's a problem, the problem isn't hers. A ripple passed through the room. My parents looked at each other, then at our daughter, then at my husband. For the first time, they were genuinely uncertain, stripped of the control they had long taken for granted. My daughter smiled. That radiant, fearless smile that seemed to light the room. And I realized something crucial. It wasn't just about defending her anymore. It was about teaching her, and all of us, that courage, fairness, and love can overturn generations of expectations. After that night, the subtle changes became permanent. My parents began treating her differently, not just tolerating her, but respecting her. My daughter carried herself with confidence in school, with her friends, even with strangers. And my husband, he remained the quiet force that had transformed our family forever. Years later, we tell the story again and again, each retelling more vivid than the last. The clink of the glass, the pause before he spoke, the unwavering defense of our child. It has become a legend in our family, a reminder of the night courage spoke louder than tradition, of the night love demanded respect, and of the night we all learned what it truly means to protect the ones you cherish. And every time I see my daughter, I know the lesson of that night will stay with her forever, that even in a world that tries to define her worth, she will always have someone by her side to remind her that her place at the table is never negotiable. That courage, once witnessed, becomes contagious, and it has the power to rewrite the rules of family, love, and life itself. Because some nights are not just dinners. Some nights are revolutions in disguise. And that night changed everything. Years had passed since that fateful night, yet the memory remained alive in every corner of our lives. Our daughter had grown into a confident, fearless young girl, and every milestone she reached carried the echo of that evening, the night someone had stood up for her and refused to let tradition dictate her worth. Then came the anniversary dinner, our unspoken tradition to commemorate the family meal that had changed everything. My parents invited us, perhaps hoping to reclaim some sense of control, though I could see the unease behind their practiced smiles. The air was thick with expectation. Every glance, every movement seemed loaded with history. My daughter, now older and wiser than her years, sat straight-backed, radiating quiet authority. My husband, as always, was calm, observing every subtle move, every word, every glance. And then it happened. My father, in a clumsy attempt to assert his old dominance, made a sharp remark about her choices, implying she was too bold for family gatherings. She didn't flinch. She didn't even hesitate. She looked him directly in the eyes and said clearly, confidently, "I am exactly who I am meant to be, and I deserve my place here." A hush fell over the room. My mother's hand trembled as she gripped the tablecloth. My father's jaw tightened. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Then my husband lifted his glass and tapped it, slowly, deliberately. Clink. The sound resonated like a drumbeat, commanding attention, pulling every eye toward him. He stood, tall and unwavering, and spoke in a voice that was soft but contained the force of a hurricane. "Not now, not ever. She will not be diminished. Her worth is not negotiable, and neither is her place at this table. If that threatens you, the problem is yours, not hers." The room froze. Time itself seemed to pause. My parents exchanged glances, silent arguments flickering in their eyes, but they were unable to speak. The authority that had long defined them had crumbled under a quiet but unyielding truth. My daughter's face lit up with a triumphant, radiant smile. That smile, full of pride, relief, and newfound confidence, was the spark of a revolution that had begun years ago but finally found its visible victory. I watched her and felt a surge of gratitude, awe, and love for the man who had silently reshaped our family's destiny that night. The evening continued, but it was different now. Every conversation, every laugh, carried the weight of what had transpired. My parents were quieter, more measured, but a seed of respect had been planted. Our daughter moved through the room with grace and confidence, no longer shadowed by judgment, no longer defined by others' expectations. That night became a legend in our family, a story retold at every gathering, a reminder of courage, love, and the power of standing up for what is right. It wasn't just about defending a child. It was about rewriting generations of expectation, about showing that true strength comes not from authority or tradition, but from protection, integrity, and unwavering love. And as we left that evening, I looked at my daughter, and I knew this would stay with her forever. She would remember the sound of the glass, the pause before his words, the way courage had spoken louder than fear. She would carry that lesson into every corner of her life, that no one, not tradition, not authority, not even family hierarchy, can take away her worth. Because some nights are more than meals. Some nights are revolutions. Some nights are proof that love, courage, and integrity can change everything. And that night had changed everything. Even now, years later, when I watch her grow into her own power, I can still hear it, the tap of the glass, the unwavering voice, the courage that refused to be silenced. That one act became a lifetime lesson. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand, one voice refusing to yield, to change the course of a life, and a family, forever. The silence that followed my husband's words was thick enough to taste. My parents' faces were pale, their carefully rehearsed composure shattered. I could see the storm of thoughts raging behind their eyes, years of pride, control, and expectation suddenly colliding with the undeniable truth of our daughter's worth. My father's hands clenched into fists on the table. I knew him too well. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to assert authority, to reclaim control. But the words my husband had spoken were immovable. He had built a wall that even my father couldn't breach. For the first time, I saw fear in my father's eyes, mingled with disbelief. My mother's reaction was quieter but no less telling. She kept her lips tightly pressed together, her fingers twitching nervously. She had spent decades teaching me how to follow rules, how to respect hierarchy, how to avoid confrontation, but now, all those lessons seemed hollow. She was forced to acknowledge that her granddaughter, and by extension, her daughter, could not be diminished by tradition. And then there was my daughter. Sitting in her chair, she straightened her back, her little hands resting firmly on the table. Her eyes, wide and unwavering, locked on my father's. She was no longer the timid child who hesitated before speaking. She was strong. She was certain. She had inherited courage not from birthright, but from witnessing it, living it, and being protected by it. The room was still. Each heartbeat felt amplified, echoing like drums in a cathedral. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, my daughter whispered, "I'm not afraid." It was a small phrase, yet it carried a force greater than any lecture, any reprimand, any tradition my parents had ever imposed. My husband smiled faintly, a quiet approval in his eyes, and I felt a rush of emotion I couldn't name, pride, relief, and awe all at once. My father finally spoke, his voice a low murmur. "Perhaps we've been wrong." It wasn't an apology yet, not fully, but it was a crack in the armor. A seed of recognition that the world does not bend to arrogance or fear, but to courage, love, and unwavering integrity. And then, just like that, the tension began to shift. My mother reached for my daughter's hand across the table, tentative, almost afraid to touch her. "You are brave," she whispered. My daughter smiled, squeezing her hand gently. The gesture, small and delicate, felt monumental, a truce forged in quiet acknowledgement, a lesson learned without words. I glanced at my husband. His calm, unwavering presence had changed everything. He didn't need to shout, to threaten, or to dominate. He simply stood, tapped his glass, and spoke with unshakable conviction. And in that single moment, the room, and our family, transformed. As the evening continued, laughter began to bubble up slowly, cautiously, like water breaking through ice. My daughter's voice carried across the table, confident and clear. My parents listened, no longer dictating, no longer judging, but hearing. Truly hearing. That night marked more than a victory at the dinner table. It marked the beginning of a new era for our family, a shift in power, in respect, in love. Our daughter would carry that night with her for the rest of her life, a reminder that courage and integrity matter more than tradition, that standing up for what is right can change generations, and that love, when combined with conviction, is unstoppable. And as we left that dinner, walking into the cool night air, I looked at my daughter's face, radiant, fearless, and unshakable. I knew that she would never forget this lesson. And perhaps, one day, she would pass it on. Because that night, what began as a simple dinner became a revolution. A reminder that some acts of courage, though quiet, have the power to rewrite everything. That love, when defended fiercely and wisely, cannot be erased. And that every time someone stands up for another, every time someone refuses to let injustice prevail, the world, small as it may seem, changes forever. And as we walked home that night, I looked at my daughter and knew she would carry this lesson for the rest of her life, that courage matters more than fear, that love is stronger than tradition, and that one brave act can change not just a moment, but everything that comes after.